Yesterday, a coordinated regulatory maneuver executed simultaneously in Ottawa and Brussels rewrote the rules of engagement for global trade and severed the digital nervous system of over 4 million subscribers across 37 countries. In a sudden escalation with no modern precedent, Canada and the European Union issued a joint decree giving Elon Musk's Starlink a definitive 90-day clock to deactivate its ground infrastructure, vacate its spectrum licenses, and completely cease commercial operations within their territories. This was not an antitrust fine or a routine data audit. It was an outright structural ban by two of Washington's oldest and most technologically integrated allies, targeting a flagship American aerospace asset. The context of this rupture traced back to the implementation of aggressive U.S. tariff policies designed to force allied economies into bilateral trade concessions. Historically, trade disputes of this magnitude followed a highly predictable script where targeted nations retaliated with symmetrical counter-tariffs on industrial goods, agricultural products, or manufactured commodities. This specific action, however, represents a sharp departure from that standard playbook by bypassing the economic friction of import duties altogether and weaponizing domestic regulatory authority instead. By explicitly citing ongoing economic hostilities with the United States as the strategic justification for the ban, Canada and the European Union have transformed sovereign regulatory permissions from mundane administrative paperwork into highly precise tools of asymmetric economic retaliation. That sequence of events began with an announcement at 9 a.m. Eastern Time under Section 5 of the Canadian Radio Communication Act, where Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry declared the immediate revocation of Starlink's spectrum licenses. That specific legal pathway is significant because spectrum allocations in Canada are legally defined as discretionary state permissions rather than permanent property rights. By framing the action as the expiration of a sovereign lease rather than the expropriation of commercial property, Ottawa established an immediate international legal defense that fundamentally insulates the decision from standard trade treaty challenges. That initial regulatory strike established a template that shifted the legal debate away from asset seizure and squarely onto the baseline principle of national resource sovereignty. Exactly 3 hours later, the European Commission accelerated the offensive by activating its newly established digital sovereignty framework across all 27 member states, effectively cutting off the physical and operational lifeblood of the satellite network. This mechanism systematically suspended Starlink's ground station operating permits, terminated its regional spectrum coordination agreements, and revoked its critical data routing authorizations, which effectively blocked European user data from transiting through auxiliary facilities located on U.S. soil. The core of the European decree rests on a single bureaucratic clause stating that satellite infrastructure subject to a foreign jurisdiction engaged in coercive trade practices constitutes an incompatible strategic vulnerability. That specific wording tells you that the target is no longer just one satellite operator, but rather the entire structural presence of American technology infrastructure operating within the European regulatory perimeter. The immediate pushback from corporate headquarters framed the ban as an illegal, politically motivated violation of global connectivity and free speech, launching a multi-jurisdictional legal challenge spanning national courts, international arbitration panels, and the World Trade Organization. That specific defense, however, miscalculated the legal architecture of the offensive by treating a regulatory lease dispute as if it were a standard commercial asset theft. Because Starlink's domestic market penetration in Canada represents just 2.3% of total households, the political cost of losing the service remained negligible for the host governments, while the operational cost fell entirely on the parent firm. That asymmetric leverage allowed Ottawa and Brussels to absorb the corporate counteroffensive without facing significant domestic blowback from the broader electorate. This strategic vulnerability is inherent to the physical and administrative reality of satellite operations, which require an unbroken chain of host government permissions, including local spectrum allocations, ground station land use permits, and transborder data authorizations to function. The strategic execution of the ban demonstrates that in a high-stakes trade conflict, an American company reliant on continuous foreign regulatory renewals is fundamentally exposed to rapid state-level deplatforming. The immediate consequence of this reality was an abrupt downward revision of SpaceX's private valuation toward a lower threshold within 72 hours of the announcement, as major investment bank analysts stripped international expansion assumptions outside of their financial models. That sudden contraction erased an estimated $20 billion from the chief executive's personal net worth in a single week, proving that political proximity to Washington's trade architecture acts as an operational target rather than a commercial shield. The resulting shockwave triggered immediate defensive repositioning across Silicon Valley, where major technology firms rushed to insulate their international operations from the emerging regulatory doctrine. Within 7 days of the ban, Amazon Web Services filed formal disclosures indicating an urgent reassessment of its operating permissions in elevated risk jurisdictions, while Microsoft issued immediate statements emphasizing localized data compliance and absolute national sovereignty. Simultaneously, Google Cloud compressed its multi-year European data localization timeline from a 2028 target down to 2026, and Meta dispatched its senior legal team to Brussels to explicitly decouple its corporate posture from the administration's trade positions. That rapid alignment tells you that the American technology sector now views domestic regulatory compliance in allied markets as a matter of immediate survival rather than long-term corporate strategy beyond the commercial landscape. The ban initiated a profound realignment within international defense planning circles, forcing an immediate Pentagon review of military communications dependencies on commercial satellite networks. While existing government-to-government defense contracts remain insulated from civilian market bans, the strategic reality is that NATO and allied militaries now face a long-term divergence in their underlying communications architecture. Within days of the joint announcement, Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and South Korea's telecommunications regulator initiated parallel structural reviews of foreign-controlled satellite services operating within their borders. Australia's Department of Infrastructure delivered a classified briefing to cabinet ministers analyzing the applicability of the Canada-EU template, while India's Department of Telecommunications indefinitely suspended a 2-year market entry review for American satellite infrastructure. The domestic political response in the United States fractured rapidly along corporate and industrial fault lines, as the National Association of Manufacturers and the Business Roundtable issued sharp warnings regarding the exposure of American assets abroad. 3 senior Republican senators representing major technology manufacturing hubs broke ranks with the executive branch, issuing a joint statement that characterized the failure to anticipate regulatory retaliation as a form of economic self-sabotage. The entire paradigm of the trade dispute shifted permanently at a joint press conference in Europe, when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a measured, central banker-style address completely devoid of standard political hyperbole. In explaining why his government bypassed traditional import tariffs, he noted that counter-tariffs inherently harm domestic consumers, whereas identifying and withdrawing permissions from highly exposed foreign technology assets allows for absolute economic precision. What that formulation does structurally is establish a comprehensive international doctrine encapsulated by a single closing phrase: "Your tariffs chose our targets for us." That doctrine informs every technology executive and sovereign state that any future trade restriction imposed by Washington can be met not with an expensive tariff war, but with the systematic legal revocation of operating permits, cloud storage authorizations, financial processing access, and pharmaceutical approvals. The ultimate paradox of the administration's strategy is that a policy designed to inflict maximum economic pain on foreign capitals has instead provided those capitals with a cheaper, more devastating weapon that targets the crown jewels of the American digital economy. But the more consequential question the one that global financial markets and defense planners are watching with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. The sudden enforcement of the 90-day deactivation clock against Starlink established an asymmetric paradigm in modern economic warfare, leaving the American technology sector exposed to systemic regulatory deplatforming. The core tension rests on a fundamental legal and political mismatch, while corporate headquarters challenges the ban on grounds of property rights and global connectivity. Host governments are operating on the unassailable baseline of national resource sovereignty. This divergence has effectively dismantled the traditional assumption that political proximity to Washington provides a shield for American commercial interests abroad. A critical data point illustrating this vulnerability emerged from the European Commission's Directorate General for Competition, which documented that American cloud, data, and communication providers currently control over 72% of the European enterprise market. This high concentration of market share means that the regulatory template enacted against Starlink is not an isolated incident, but rather a structural test case for a broader decoupling strategy. That high level of exposure gives allied regulators immense leverage, as they can systematically target high-value digital assets without disrupting the flow of physical goods across their borders. This structural asymmetry ensures that any further escalation in U.S. tariff policy can be met with highly localized, high-impact regulatory interventions that inflict severe capital losses on American firms. This reality was underscored by an internal memorandum circulated within the European Council, which noted that the digital sovereignty framework could be legally extended to financial data processors and cloud service providers within 60 days of a confirmed trade violation. This detail tells you that the legal architecture deployed in Brussels was designed from its inception to be modular, allowing authorities to swap out satellite spectrum licenses for banking authorizations or data storage permits as the political situation demands. What that framework does structurally is transform routine corporate regulatory compliance into a geopolitical variable, directly tied to the status of international trade negotiations. This administrative mechanism permanently alters the risk assessment for multinational corporations, forcing them to treat local regulatory permits as conditional assets rather than stable operating rights. The strategic change behind this regulatory offensive became undeniable following the release of the bilateral Ottawa-Brussels Joint Action Plan, a document finalized exactly 45 days before the public announcement. This timeline reveals a deliberate choice to establish a comprehensive legal framework well in advance of the latest U.S. tariff announcements, proving that the bans were part of a long-term defensive strategy rather than a reactive political gesture. That sequence is not coincidental. It represents a calculated shift toward proactive legal containment, ensuring that when the economic trigger arrived, the execution was flawless and instantaneous. This high level of bureaucratic synchronization effectively deprived Washington of the traditional window used to deploy diplomatic pressure or corporate lobbying to stall foreign legislation. A key official statement from the Canadian Department of Finance reinforced this strategic precision, noting that the $2 billion sovereign satellite initiative would be funded entirely through redirected capital that had previously been earmarked for cross-border telecom infrastructure. What that deployment of capital reveals is a conscious decision to utilize the trade dispute as an accelerator for domestic industrial policy, turning a defensive retaliatory measure into a long-term sovereign asset. That economic pivot guarantees that even if a future trade agreement restores Starlink's operating permissions, the commercial landscape will have permanently shifted in favor of heavily subsidized domestic competitors. This state-backed infrastructure development effectively insulates the host country from future American economic coercion by creating independent, national alternatives for critical communications. The long-term implications of this strategy were captured by the European Union's Commissioner for Financial Programming and Budget, who stated during a closed-door committee hearing, "Our objective is not to negotiate a temporary reduction in steel or aluminum duties, but to permanently eliminate the strategic leverage that foreign technology monopolies hold over our sovereign governance. What that statement reveals is a profound shift in intent, moving away from standard tactical trade concessions toward a permanent realignment of digital dependency. That explicit rejection of the traditional tariff-for-tariff negotiating framework demonstrates that allied nations are no longer willing to accept an economic model where their critical infrastructure remains vulnerable to unilateral policy shifts. In Washington, this fundamental change in perspective guarantees that the regulatory barriers currently being erected will remain structural fixtures of the international digital economy for decades. This structural transformation is further evidenced by the immediate reallocation of 11 billion euros from the European Defence and Space Fund to fast-track the commercial deployment of the IRIS-Quadri satellite constellation. This capital injection represents a massive acceleration of an infrastructure program that had previously been delayed by standard bureaucratic inertia, compressing an 8-year development schedule into a 4-year mandate. This shift in funding priority signals to global financial markets that European authorities are willing to absorb substantial upfront capital expenditures to achieve total operational independence in the aerospace sector. The long-term result of this funding pivot will be the emergence of a heavily capitalized, state-sanctioned competitor capable of challenging American aerospace dominance, not just in Europe, but across the entire global market. The geopolitical contagion has already begun to manifest in the Indo-Pacific region, where Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications released data showing that foreign entities control over 65% of the country's sensitive data routing nodes. This statistical disclosure was immediately followed by a formal policy directive, establishing a comprehensive review of all foreign-operated communications infrastructure under the auspices of national security. That specific sequencing demonstrates how the Canada-EU template is being actively mirrored by other major economic powers seeking to reduce their structural exposure to American unilateralism. This systematic adoption of the regulatory revocation template indicates that the global digital economy is fracturing along geopolitical lines, as nations prioritize security and digital sovereignty over market efficiency. The vulnerability of American corporate structures is exacerbated by the internal financial composition of these technology firms, which rely heavily on uninterrupted access to foreign consumer data to sustain their primary valuation models. Financial data from New York investment firms indicates that international market operations account for up to 45% of the projected revenue growth for top-tier Silicon Valley companies over the next decade. By introducing regulatory instability into these growth calculations, foreign governments have found a way to strike at the core capitalization of the American tech sector without imposing a single trade tariff. This targeted destruction of equity value forces corporate boards to reconsider their relationship with the executive branch's trade agenda, creating a profound domestic political fracture within the United States. This domestic friction became visible during an emergency session of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where data was presented showing that over 120 senior executives from the technology and defense sectors had requested urgent clarification on the government's strategy to protect foreign assets. The executive branch's refusal to engage with these corporate requests reveals a widening gap between the administration's nationalist trade policy and the global operational realities of its most advanced economic sectors. This lack of policy alignment ensures that American multinational corporations will increasingly act as independent geopolitical agents, altering their supply chains and data localization practices to appease foreign regulators, even when it conflicts with Washington's stated objectives. The ultimate efficacy of this regulatory offensive now hinges on a single, highly sensitive operational intersection: the upcoming standard renewal date for transatlantic undersea data cable operating permits, scheduled to occur in exactly 90 days. This pending administrative deadline represents the physical choke point of the global internet, as these cable networks carry over 95% of all intercontinental financial data and corporate communications between North America and Europe. If European regulators apply the identical digital sovereignty criteria to these undersea fiber optic links that they applied to Starlink's satellite constellation, the entire architecture of global digital commerce faces immediate fragmentation. The decision by Brussels to either renew these permits or weaponize them as the next step in the precision doctrine remains the critical unresolved pivot that will determine the final outcome of this transatlantic economic war. The administrative battle lines drawn around Starlink's 90-day deactivation clock reveal that the true scope of this conflict extends far beyond a localized dispute over satellite spectrum licenses or rural internet connectivity. What began as a blunt exercise in cross-border trade leverage has permanently ruptured the regulatory equilibrium that previously governed transatlantic data flows and international corporate investments. By isolating Starlink as a highly exposed administrative target, Canada and the European Union have successfully demonstrated that the digital platforms anchoring the modern global economy are not invulnerable entities, but conditional systems operating entirely at the pleasure of host government permits. This systemic pivot redefines the geopolitical calculus for all key international actors, shifting the core priority of statecraft away from market integration and directly toward absolute infrastructure insulation. For Canada, the immediate mobilization of the $2.4 billion Sovereign Satellite Initiative represents a comprehensive effort to decouple its northern and rural communications architecture from the continuous risk of American political instability. For the European Union, the rapid structural acceleration of the Iris Quadri constellation serves as a model for a much broader strategy to insulate its entire continent-wide enterprise sector from foreign jurisdiction exposure. Even India's abrupt suspension of Starlink's long-pending market entry review confirms that this doctrine of administrative exclusion is being actively internalized by rising economic powers, seeking to preemptively mitigate their own technological vulnerabilities. The defensive realignment currently sweeping through Silicon Valley reinforces this systemic shift. As multi-billion-dollar enterprise giants aggressively restructure their international footprints to evade localized regulatory execution, the rapid acceleration of Google Cloud's data localization program and AWS's formal reassessments of operating stability prove that the American technology sector no longer views its global dominance as a guaranteed baseline. This frantic corporate repositioning demonstrates an acute awareness that any future escalation in Washington's trade policies will be met with immediate, surgical countermeasures aimed at the legal permissions holding their overseas market shares together. Consequently, the primary vector of international competition has moved out of the open market and directly into the administrative arenas, where national sovereignty over data, spectrum, and physical infrastructure is strictly enforced. Ultimately, the overarching pattern revealed by this unprecedented confrontation dismantles the fundamental premise upon which modern economic diplomacy was built for over half a century. The core insight emerging from this transatlantic fracture is that the global digital economy is no longer governed by the borderless principles of technological efficiency or capital optimization, but by the raw, immutable logic of sovereign jurisdiction. When national governments discover that the precise revocation of administrative permits is a cheaper, more insulated, and structurally more devastating weapon than any traditional tariff wall, the foundational security of foreign assets vanishes entirely. The single most important takeaway from this structural transformation is that in an era of unbridled economic nationalism, an open global tech market can only exist when there is absolute political stability between the sovereign powers that grant it permission to operate. The administrative template engineered by Ottawa and Brussels has permanently weaponized the routine, regulatory paperwork that keeps the international digital architecture connected. By explicitly matching every external tariff increase with the localized termination of a vital corporate operating permit, Allied nations have forced Washington to confront the steep structural costs of treating strategic partners as economic adversaries. The immediate financial and military realignments observed from Tokyo to New Delhi indicate that this precision doctrine is rapidly becoming the new baseline for global trade retaliation. As the 90-day countdown clock ticks toward expiration and the pending review of transatlantic undersea data cable permits approaches, the primary question hanging over global commerce is no